As with the previous album, Chairs Missing, Wire took their approach to rock and roll, to recorded rock music, as this very art school kind of approach. They decided that they would take all of the pieces and the parameters and think about them before they were playing them. Think about how everything was going to bounce off of each other. Less thinking about jams and a kind of primal urge and this sort of, you know, it was a different kind of masturbatory, you could say. It was one of trying to appease and flatter their intellect rather than their heart and their kind of I guess it's more more of a appraisal of their egos than their id. According to a description on Wire's website, 1979's 154 represented the final tableau in Wire's Harvest released 70s triptych, and was the first Wire album to be released to a universal set of 5-star reviews from the British rock weeklies. Thus it represented the point when the British pop culture establishment publicly recognised Wire's primacy. 154 makes 95% of the competition look feeble, wrote Nick Kent in The Enemy. Wire are achieving a lot of things other and more recognised names have been striving for, wrote Chris Westwood in Record Mirror. The album is a musical tour de force, wrote John Savage in Melody Maker. 154 is the Wire album that is the most popular from the 70s albums amongst Wire fans. Perhaps perversely, Wire fans tend to be the least enamoured of Pink Flag, and has had the most diverse influence, across many genres, of the three, and despite the only slightly less stellar Pitchfork media rating of 9.1, good Pitchfork reviews tend to get at a 7.5 to 8.5 rating, 154 manages to hold its own, rating a respectable number 11 in Rate Your Music's chart of 1979, voted for by real people rather than music journalists. Chairs Missing made number 3 in 1978's chart, Pink Flag number 9 in 1977's. I'm betting this is Colin Newman writing this quite smugly and proudly. And here's what Mike Fawn, the producer of these first 3 albums, has had to write on this particular website, Stereo Society. I don't know if it's published for this website. This text is from June 2000, apparently. Let's read it out here. The record business is retrospective and reactionary. You make an album, do something creative, and thus trigger the follow-up process. Interviews, performances on TV and radio, chat shows, touring the album material, recycling material to create a new event, be it the next single off the album, with associated remixes and outtakes, or some dubious charity all-star extravaganza. Why I cared more about their development, measured by exploration and conscious, sometimes inevitably self-conscious, innovation then following the getting rich and famous routine. This attitude and its uncompromising application provided an exceptionally creative setup for their third album. It was to be the last we would work on together, and they'll last until they regrouped to record The Ideal Copy for release in 1987. A few years after that, Robert would depart to leave the rump group called Wire. I proposed that they would be more in character to drop the W rather than the E, but was years too late. Wire were dead. Long live Wire. And other cliches. The Wire business was growing at the end of 1978, although not without hiccups. Pink Flag had received an indifferent release by Capitol in the US, and the most excitement I'd experienced, aside from one or two notable local enthusiasts, was from a publisher who told me about the amount of work he had put into adjusting the publishing deal to a 21-track album from the standard American 10. After Capitol passed on the next one, Warner Brothers Records signed them and would release the next album. Coincidentally, on November 16th, Wire were playing a showcase at Virgin's prominent London gig, The Venue. Unusually, this place presented the American model of 2 shows a night, whereas the British way was to do one only, reflecting pub hours and closing time at 11 p.m. Everyone grumbled, what could a fellow do? The Warner's people were in town in strength when their table was booked for the first set. The press the next week was uniformly critical, a kind of contained chaos. Wire border on unlistenable, listless tedium. Wire may just not be a live band. I was playing that night, and stage was a strange place covered in brown shag carpet. It was the 70s, remember, though this was going a bit far. The sound on stage was completely dead, and it felt as if we were in some sort of acoustic cocoon, the audience somewhere in the distance. The first set went very well, we thought, and we heard from Mike Collins, the manager, that the Warner's people had really liked it too and were staying for the second. The Brits didn't quite manage to pace their social activities with a second set looming, meaning that we all had too much to drink after the first. The second did, however, seem to be going very nicely. I had my head down over some fancy, for me, fingering when I felt an interruption in our performance lock. Something had happened, some disturbance. Looking up, the stage seemed empty. I listened and counted, all present. Then I saw the back of the stage, which had once been a very elegant wall of guitar amplifiers. Music Man. It was breached, and legs were waving. Graham, always showing off, as Colin uncharitably put it later, had been waving his bass around even more extrovertly than usual, got tangled in his cord and the shag carpet, and had fallen backwards. Colin's amp went with him. He was still lying there, his head pummeled by Colin's guitar noises, shouting to the roadie who was trying to pull him to his feet to leave him alone, that he was perfectly happy where he was. Warner Brothers duly released 154 in late 1979. In any case, Wire were poised for European commercial success as the second album wound down in the media. They were the freshest thing to come out of the post-punk new wave and maintained an uncompromising and sometimes self-destructively ingenious integrity. They might have been arty, but they kept to those touted street-clad principles. The ultimate accolade seemed to be theirs when they were booked as support on the Roxy Music European tour. The art school graduate/dropout tradition persisted, and here were two generations on stage on the same bill. Wire sometimes went down well, but showbiz didn't work easily for them. The mechanics of big league touring in support of an album already embalmed in vinyl both intimidated and disgusted them, although once they got the measure of them they started playing in new provocative ways. Just as Delirium fans didn't get to hear Pink Flag, the Roxy Music fans weren't exposed to the recycled chairs missing. They got the whole new batch of songs that was the foundation of 154. As a result, Wire came to their third album with material that had been tested in the lab, songs that had been played in before a restless and often intolerant audience. That turned out to be an unusual and deserved privilege and an enormous creative springboard. These were fraught sessions. Perhaps we'd all been living together too long, although the experimental mood on the album was served by the conversational shorthand you develop over a long time when fewer words are necessary to explain. After a few quick demos to test and for the five of us to just settle in again, we went off to Advision. It was like hearing a new group. The confidence and strength gained with the songs on the road immediately effective. Since they were delivering so strongly, the foundation of a track, which could then be pulled around and reconstructed, was relatively easy to achieve, so that the overall transmutation could be greater. The playing intensity was still often at the very edge of what they could do, the strain of getting a reasonably flawless performance of two people in a room, reminiscent of the nail-biting during 12XU. There's nothing more frustrating than screwing yourself up for the take, hitting the high tensions, feeling everything motoring and then making a dumb mistake. The higher the music's intensity, the more a wrong move drives you crazy. The publishing credits on the second album show the start of the group's splintering underway. Many groups start off idealistically sharing credit for the writing, acknowledging that all contribute to the sound and atmosphere, even if they don't physically write the musical lyrics. The third Wire album accentuated the jealousies that caused such splits. It may have been that the tension contributed to the music, but it was often very hard work indeed. Sometimes the mood really would feel like once is enough, a true piece of art noise, almost incomprehensible at this distance, epitomized by the clangs and crashes coming from Graham, hammer in hand, rampaging around a studio full of scrap metal, which took some time setting up but not much time to record. Its sibling on the album, The Other Window, also has aggressive noises tearing you apart. The drums which trample across out of time halfway through had no relation to tempo or accent, and was simply a big angry gesture suggested in jest by the engineer which I picked up on. He later said that he had meant them to be played along with the track. With Wire in experimental and mood hyperdrive, the unrelated bludgeon was most appropriate and effective. This time we would get the vocal balance right, and its projects some of their best efforts ever. On Jazz Missing, the vocal balance was a throwback to punk, where they were just right on top of the instrumental mayhem. The arrangements on 154 support the voice far better. Once you're away from the punk thrash, you can work timbers far more easily for vocal support or counterpoint. Indirect Enquiries features one of Colin's strongest and most startling deliveries ever. I can't remember whether we used the vocal from the original take. As Colin and Graham got more comfortable in the studio, they were increasingly able to plant the mood of the initial recorded take back in their heads and replace/improved more vocals. From his opening, you gained respect as we passed. The control room was paying close attention, just as you do when he startles you on the recording. His delivery of lying prone at the start of the third verse comes from another planet. Perhaps because of the nastiness of the song, we were getting on well the day of the vocals, and the idea came up to layer. you've been defaced at various speeds over the final build. You can hear the results in the deepest growling sounds and the highest pitched chipmunks. It was the end of the day, and 3 or 4 friends stopped by to pick us up and gathered in the back of the control room. After 2 takes, they were out of there and in reception, even though we were laughing at the often ridiculous results, and with delight. It must have been truly creepy. Some of the sweetest wire things are also on this album. Colin's multiple vocals on map reference 41 North, 93 West sound like some hyper-pop song, and like Outdoor Miner before, its vocal accessibility belies the oblique lyrics. The stories behind the words are generally to be found in Kevin Eden's entertaining and comprehensive biography, Wire Everybody Loves a History, but I took them straight, typically only hearing the background much later. There are some songs of relentless beauty, not, as many think, a quality excluded from the Wire credo. A mutual friend introduces the extraordinary sound of the cor anglais, essentially a large oboe, following Collins-inspired suggestion. And also on this track is the unusual sound of a very deep bass voice from Hilly Crystal, the owner of CBGB's now, as then, with whom I was working with, producing the shirts whom he managed. An extraordinary transmutation through violence into something perversely sweet takes place in the longest piece on the 3 albums. A touching display lasts nearly 7 minutes and is in 2 parts. The first is moody and suppressed. The viola has arrived. Tim Souster was an old composer friend who had studied and played under Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, was utterly at home with electronic sound and played the electric viola, or had done since he had to get it fixed for this session. We set him up with his viola feeding 3 separate amps, each with a time delay in its path. We had 3 Music Man combo models among us. The enveloping sound in his playing area in the middle of the large studio was magic. 4 microphones, naturally. Having heard the tape a week before, he had written the elegiac line in the first part, which we all loved. This was the sort of intro that could set up the vocal for maximum impact, and it did just that for Graham. Part 2 is different, smashing him with a big distortion effect on Graham's bass. You never lose interest for the next 3 minutes as Tim's multiple performances climb out of the newly violent murk one at a time, hitting a final chord complementing bass and guitars, which surprised even him. He hadn't heard it until playback in the control room, since he wasn't hearing the build-up of his improvised contributions. I don't think the chord has too simple a name, but I never figured it out, just enjoyed it. Thus climaxed one of the most fruitful musician introductions I have ever made. Many pines followed, naturally. Everyone was getting along that night. The mixing went smoothly and turned out eventually as a polished album which still incorporated their ideal experimental wildness. About halfway through, though, the personal wear and tear finally got to me. The music may have been improved by the personal tensions. Many producers will actually calculatedly set up some session drama on the principle that people on edge make intense music. In Hollywood, when people do unspeakable things to each other, it's all for the sake of the project, darling. However, this was simply too high a price to pay for it. One morning before session, I called Mick Collins, the manager, and told him I couldn't go on any further after the album. Please don't tell the group. He did. I think there was relief all round in anticipation of the end. After 154 was released, the group carried on their experimental route for a while, notably with a series of memorable gigs, performance art rather than music, at the Jeanette Cochrane Theatre, a small space in Bloomsbury, London. They self-produced a half-hearted single, Our Swimmer, at Scorpio Studios in London, but split energetically to pursue their own solo projects, which were so radically different that it seemed a miracle that these 4 had existed in the same room and breathed the same air for 3 years. But that was the strength of Wire. However bruising the control room confrontations, however different the points of view, a different brand of music would emerge from the tension. Those were magic times of furious growth and learning for all of us. I leave with a personal note from the mid-80s, a letter to which I responded too late, after we had talked about novel ways of recording and what we might do next together. No, it wouldn't have happened anyway at that time. I dimly and pleasantly remember the beer outside at the Spread Eagle pub in Camden. It started to rain after the 3rd pint, I think. It's a letter, Bruce Gilbert, to Mike Fawn, circa 1986. Dear Mr. Fawn, it has come to our attention that you have in the past worked with a group called Wire. What we need to know is, are you prepared to work with this group again? And if you are, which of the following cheapo would you like to wear? Please delete where necessary. Musician, composer, producer, financial partner, fellow conspirator, drinking partner, referee, bomb disposal expert. We would like to point out that this is a one-off operation, and should you be captured, we will deny all knowledge of you and said train set. Please tear off red section and return to B.C. Gilbert. Meanwhile, we are just to what we praise anyhow.
For we are the iron and the bough, and the sweetness of danger that ripens.
Yes, YO is certainly one of the groups in the history of the recorded music canon which ought to be remembered. And I think it's becoming more and more obvious why, without even having to listen to the music itself. If it makes you more excited to listen to the music, so be it. And if you do know the music, it's probably making you love the music a hell of a lot more, making you realize why you loved it so much in the first place. Thanks again, my good and dear friends everywhere.